Welcome to the Holy Post. A new report from the CDC finds a record number of teenage girls are now suffering from mental illnesses including depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. And social psychologist Jonathan Haidt says the evidence is abundant that social media is the cause, but the tech industry is resisting any changes. Today we discuss the social, political, and spiritual dimensions of the crisis. We also revisit the Asbury Revival and how previous revivals in the U.S. produced both good and bad fruit. Then New Testament professor Scot McKnight is back to talk about his latest book, Revelation for the Rest of Us. He argues that a literal reading of the book isn't just wrong, but flat out dangerous. You'll get to hear his take on the book, and if you're a Holy Post supporter, we have a bonus interview with Scot McKnight where he tackles the whole issue of the millennium from Revelation 20. We often get caught up in conversations about are you pre-mill, post-mill, a-mill. McKnight says that entire way of thinking about the millennium is flawed. It's a pretty eye-opening conversation, so for our Holy Post supporters, definitely check that out. If you're not yet a supporter, go to holypost.com and click Support Us to get access to that bonus interview and a whole bunch of other stuff. We have that, plus unstoppable Canadian super pigs are coming for us. Here is episode 554.
Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is Phil Vischer. It's the Holy Post Podcast. I'm here with Sky Jitani. Hi, Sky.
Hi, Phil.
How are you?
I am peachy.
Oh, that's fantastic. And Caitlin, Caitlin, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Phil?
Good. All your homework done today?
Actually, yes.
Oh,
I did.
wow.
I really had the thought before we got on recording, like, I'm a free woman after this.
Oh my goodness. So
day.
we have your undivided attention. Maybe for the first time ever. Completely undivided attention.
I'm doing an interview immediately after this, so that's you've got it a little divided. But the Holy Post as a whole has all of my attention.
Oh,
Priorities right.
Oh, yeah, you're doing an interview for the Holy Post. Okay,
Yeah.
I thought like you were, NPR's hanging on hold, so I got to get off of this so I can talk to Terry Gross. Okay, now for the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Caitlin.
I got some animal news to start things out before we get into more. Yeah.
Yay!
More. But this is, you think, that'll be cute and fun, but this is kind of serious. This animal news is kind of serious. Highly intelligent and possibly invincible super pigs are invading America.
What?
From which border? Because that may make a difference to the response.
That's a good point.
Hey there, have you seen my pig?
Canadian super pigs.
Does that help? A hybrid breed of super pigs, a mix of a domestic pig and a wild boar, is running wild in Canada, and now they have their sights set on the United States. Originally crossbred to help farmed pigs grow larger and to tolerate the cold temperatures of Canada. A drop in the market about 2 decades ago led some farmers to let their hybrid pigs run free. Oh, hey, I don't need you no more, but you'll be sure to come back, eh? And they didn't.
This sounds like the premise for a parody of Planet of the Apes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, what are the pigs going to do?
Yeah.
So the farmers, just like the market for back bacon dropped, eh? So we just let the pigs go. I'm sure nothing bad'll happen because of that. Eh?
Phil, I'm getting worried. I feel like a lot of Canadians listen to the Holy Post.
I know one does.
Yeah. Hi, Drew. Now they're running very free, according to Field and Stream. This just in from Field and Stream, our source of the latest news. The super pigs are coming south, likely heading to Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, and Michigan. The problem? The super pigs are proving hard to eradicate. They can survive in such a cold climate is one of the big surprises of this issue. The cold hardiness of the hybrid pigs means they survive well, which means... Sky.
I have my hand raised.
Yes, I see your hand. I see that hand.
Why?
Is there another?
The article saying they're proving hard to eradicate, but why do they need to be eradicated? What other harm do they pose? Or is it just that they're Canadian?
Oh, you want to know, eh? I'll
Yeah.
tell you what they're doing. Wild hogs feed on anything. They gobble up tons and tons of goslings and ducklings in the spring. They can take down a white-tailed deer. They can take down a deer, even an adult deer. They can take down a deer. So Field and Stream thought originally it was like, wow, this is something we can hunt. But it's become clear that they're threatening the white-tailed deer, elk, and especially waterfowl, not to mention crop damage, because they go rooting through people's crops. So,
I've never liked Canadian bacon.
So,
yeah.
how are they trying to eradicate them and it's not working?
Well, you try to shoot them.
They're just resistant to being shot?
Pigs of steel.
How?
They shoot back, eh? It's a big problem. The super pigs have become adept at fending off recreational hunters, sometimes with entire groups, which are called sounders. A group of wild pigs is called a sounder. Did you know that?
This sounds like a fictional. This sounds like a fictional story made up by the NRA to justify more like armor-piercing bullets and semi-automatic guns for hunters.
No way, eh? The super pigs have become adept at fending off recreational hunters, sometimes with entire groups turning nocturnal to avoid the hunting. Other times, the groups will disperse, making them harder to locate, or change their patterns and retreat to forests or wetlands. So here's the problem. Pigs are smarter than dogs, and these are super pigs that are resistant to cold and bigger than normal pigs. So they are intelligent. It is like Planet of the Apes. We've gone too far with our crossbreeding. We've gone
This
too
is our
far.
own fault.
Yeah,
Do you know
I
what the
think we
best-
just need to submit to our pig overlords.
Yeah.
Whoa.
You're in charge now, eh? I guess you'll be eating us for breakfast. Do you know what the best strategy they've discovered to rein in the super pigs? It has a name. The strategy has a name. Do you want to know the name of the rein in the super pig strategy? It's called
They wrap them in blankets.
It's called the Judas pig concept. The Judas pig.
Not.
Yes,
They get a pig to betray the other
the
pigs?
Judas, you give a pig 50 pieces of silver. No, you catch one pig and you strap a GPS collar to it, and then you let it return home, and you trace it, and then you
Trap the rest of them.
You find the colony, and then you have to kill the queen pig, the mother of all pigs, who's the size
can't
of
you-
a small building.
Why don't you put a GPS collar on the pig that also contains a bomb? And then when it gets close to all the others, you just ching, and there you go.
I don't know how effective that would be, Sky, unless
Some
they all...
innocent bystanders might be involved.
Oh, yeah, you know
That's
what?
true.
Yeah, you're going to arm the super pigs.
Yeah. Of course,
and
the
set
pigs come
them
to
free.
America and we bomb children because we're trying to get rid of them. That's the story.
Can't they?
Oh,
wait. Well,
man.
speaking of, can't we use drones or something? There's got to be some technology that could
You
track
sound
these
so
things.
American right now.
Can't we drone them?
Can't we just
Can't we,
blast them off the face of the earth?
Just a Hellfire missile from about 1,000 feet up. Shouldn't that be able to take care of the super pigs? They're among us, Sky. They're among us. One could be in your backyard right now.
I don't think it could.
I've seen some crazy stuff in my backyard.
One could be in your garbage right now. Super pigs from Canada. Canadian super pigs. They're
I
coming
think
for
I'm
us.
more safe at least than y'all.
Yeah, it'll be a while before they get to you.
Yeah. And it's not cold here, so.
Yeah. Yeah. I have family in Minnesota and Michigan, so they're in trouble. And there are wild pigs. Wild pigs are a problem in other places because they can grow huge and they're mean and they got tusks and they'll gore you. They're dangerous, Sky.
I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it.
Okay. You think that's enough for this week? Think we should just wrap it up there?
I think
do
that's
you
enough to be
have-
frightened of.
Yeah. Don't you have any cute, nice, happy things?
About the super pigs? Some of them can
Or-
sing. I don't know.
Oh,
but-
gosh.
Hey, here's a follow-up on the Asbury Revival. You know how the revival, it's the first revival to go viral on TikTok, which...
Revival viral.
Yeah, reviral is my new term to describe it. But it may be going viral in other ways that aren't as good. The impromptu religious revival at Asbury University that attracted tens of thousands of people from across the country has now been linked to at least one case of measles, according to state health officials.
What?
So here's the official notice. Anyone who attended the revival on February 18th may have been exposed to measles. Attendees who are unvaccinated are encouraged to quarantine for 21 days and to seek immunization with the measles vaccine, which is safe and effective, we must reinforce to you.
Do we need another reason for conservative Christians to be suspicious of government action on health issues? A revival breaks out and the government says, by the way, everyone needs to quarantine because there could have been an outbreak. It's not a good look.
You should have already been vaccinated for measles.
Yeah,
like
you should
people
have,
should just have already done that.
But we don't trust experts anymore.
There's lots of people who don't vaccinate anything.
Yeah. So the revival may be going viral for less good reasons. Literally going viral. Literally. But it's still, a couple people thought that we were a little cynical about the revival last week, and I just want to say, no, I'm not cynical about the revival. I think I'm happy about it. I'm excited about it. I think it's a good thing. We were cynical about the celebrities that were showing up and saying, hey, don't you want me to be up in front leading your spontaneous revival? Because I'm a professional. But we were very happy that the administration and the faculty were saying, no, celebrities, go sit in the back or leave. This is led by students. So we were very positive about the revival. Yeah. You weren't here last week, Caitlin. What do you think about the revival?
Well, I was just going to say, I think one of the other good things about it, I appreciated y'all's conversation because I do think it's cases like this where the real blame for some of what happens is people who are just trying to exploit it for their own celebrity or their own gain, financially or otherwise. But what I've really loved is I have seen, there were students at Duke that got together in a chapel for days after they heard about the Asbury Revival and prayed and worshiped together. And I've seen reports of that in other places too. So it's just telling that, yes, there could be good reasons for showing up and trying to see what's happening. But it's also telling that lots of people's response was not, I'm going to drive to Asbury and be there. Their response was, I want to see the Spirit move in my own context. So I'm going to gather with some believers and we're going to pray and we're going to seek the Lord and we're going to worship together. And we're not trying to it's not like magic dust that we just think we can turn on and off, but we're inspired by what happened there to seek a movement of the Spirit in our own context. And we're going to be faithful with where we are. Not that right. Again, there could be good reasons for going there, but I just think it's a good reminder that even among college students, there were lots of different college students, especially colleges in the South, where people did that, where they said, we're not going to Asbury and we're not even just scrolling on TikTok. We're showing up together in small groups that are not as, viral as Asbury, but we're showing up and trying to worship together and seek the Lord.
Yeah. Did you join them at the Duke Chapel as a theologian in residence to guide them into orthodox forms of revivalism?
I definitely would not try and do that. I also didn't even know it was happening until afterwards. I'm telling you, this was not orchestrated, coordinated. It was not for the sake of social media. I heard about it because I knew someone here who is passionate about she wants not just to see revival, she wants to see people know Jesus and has been passionate about that and met with other people who are passionate about that. And I just think it's telling that I think God can move in the ways that look exactly like it has in Asbury. But I also think sometimes people get really excited about that they miss what's happening in their own context. And I just was so encouraged here to hear about people who went, I'm just going to do the thing that's in front of me right where I am.
Yeah, I'm for that. Barry Weiss, I don't know if you noticed this, the reporter Barry Weiss did this week's podcast is entirely about the Asbury Revival. It's an hour, and they actually sent someone there who's, taping it from the inside and interviewing kids, and it's pretty interesting. She's Jewish, not necessarily a believer, pro-God though, and pro-generally religious expression, so it's a very positive overall assessment of what's going on there. So it's nice to see journalists approaching things outside their own background with an open mind and not assuming bad intent on religious people. Sometimes erroneously, but
so there's a metaphor I've been using somewhat frequently. It'll probably be in my next book coming out that has been helpful for me as I think through this, and maybe like this is obviously getting a lot of attention. This whole revival, the fact that New York Times or Barry Weiss, and various other secular voices are getting engaged in this thing is interesting. But and I was out at a Christian college recently speaking, and the students there gathered and prayed for a long time after the chapel service, I think similar to what happened at Asbury. And I'm sure for good reasons, but it makes you wonder, is there a little bit of like revival envy going on in different places? And that can be really positive, like a good sort of envy. Like we're envious to experience more of God. And then there can be bad envy, which, you know, who knows what's really going on there. Anyway, the metaphor is, if you remember The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, of course you do, when Aslan shows up and the winter begins to thaw and the trees are blooming and the grass is coming through the snow and all that, and they realize this isn't just a thaw, this is springtime. I think that's a really interesting metaphor to think about the movement of God's Spirit or the arrival of the kingdom, where sometimes the kingdom arrives or the Spirit moves in a really dramatic way. Just like in the springtime, we had a huge thunderstorm come through today with tornado warnings and all that. Like sometimes spring arrives dramatically with a lot of, you know, strength and power, and it's fantastic.
Comes in like a lion. Leaves like a lamb. No,
there are other days where spring comes through and it's real gradual and gentle, and the snow's melting slowly and the stream is trickling, but it's all spring. And I think that what happens is you see a revival like Asbury, which is a movement of God and His Spirit, and it's dramatic and obvious and gets everyone's attention. And so we think, well, that's how it always has to look. It always has to be that dramatic and that big and that, you know, attention grabbing. And then we ignore the fact that, well, the Spirit's moving in my own life or my own community or my own church in a more subtle way, but it's no less powerful and real if I would just pay attention to that. And so that's the challenge here. It's not wrong to envy, oh, I want a thunderstorm kind of moment with the movement of God's Spirit. But if that doesn't happen, you need to have eyes to perceive, how is God's Spirit and kingdom moving among us in gentle ways where the spring is still here, the thaw is still happening, and how can I draw attention to that and recognize it? So I'm not against these things, obviously, at all, but they can create a myopic vision where I just want the spectacular all the time, and that can get us off track really quick.
Right. But spectacular is fun every now and then. Unless it's a tornado, then not so much. It
is also true, I think, Sky, like I 100% agree, but I also think part of what has been exciting to people, I think, about Asbury is that so many, I think especially young Christians, have gotten so comfortable in a modern Western context where they just assume there's no supernatural. And so the faith is kind of naturalized, and it's me and Jesus, and I don't expect there to be anything beyond that. And I do think one of the helpful things I saw in people who were not really imitating Asbury, but seeking something similar in their own context, was this sudden realization that, oh, like God can move in unexpected ways, and there is real spiritual power there. And I was encouraged to see people who I think have been discipled in such a way as to think that the physical world that they can touch and see and hear is all there is, to realize, no, that's not it. Like there is something else going on, and I have seen experiences of that, and I want those kinds of experiences myself. So I totally agree that I don't want people to, and I've seen some of this online, of just kind of wanting the spectacular for the spectacular's sake, but I do like that there are people saying, I recognize that there is something beyond what I just kind of naturally experience. And it's actually been central to the Christian faith for all of history for us to be the people who said that's really important. And we're in a unique cultural and historical moment where that's a hard thing to say. Like it makes people act like you're really kind of crazy, and really those are the weird Christians. The sensible ones just read thick theology books and nod along in church. Like no, but I think it's good for some young people to be like, I am hungry for a faith that takes seriously the metaphysical spiritual claims that Scripture makes, and I want to see evidence of that in my own community.
But isn't that also why we see so much popularity for Pentecostalism in,
totally.
Latin America and other parts of the world, that this faith, it should be supernatural, and the less supernatural it is, the less appealing it is to me. So, the dry Western read this book and discuss theology isn't very appealing, particularly if you're coming out of a supernatural tradition or a supernatural culture. It's like, you want me to give up believing in God to believe in God? It doesn't make any sense. So it is interesting, when we go out and try to calm people down, calm down. You're taking it too seriously. Or you're looking for features of this that we're not very comfortable with anymore. But also to not, because then you've got the New Apostolic Revival and people that spend 90% of their time studying, news events to interpret future prophecies rather than studying the Bible to have orthodox doctrine.
Can I also say, though, I think one of the things I think people have missed in a lot of the conversation about the Asbury stuff is we've kind of narrowly focused on revivalism as a feature of white Christians in America. And it is distinctive in America. Like, we have our own distinct history with this. But I recently read this really interesting book about the history of the Azusa Street Revival from a Black female scholar who specifically thinks about those dynamics in theology, Carrie Day. And she has this really interesting history of it where she's trying to focus on especially the Black women leaders of the Azusa Street Revival that most people would say, at least in America, is like the beginning of the Pentecostal tradition. And if you read that history, it's like there is emphasis on the supernatural. There is emphasis on the return of Christ. There is all the things that characterize a lot of revivalism in the U.S. more broadly. But there is a great emphasis on addressing social systemic evils.
Right.
And that's been true in even white revivalist history in America. There's often been a connection to social action. But it's just interesting to see in that tradition, this wasn't escapism to be so focused on the supernatural. It was a recognition that we've tried. I mean, this is post the Civil War. This is post some of the, in the midst of / post some of the civil rights movement. There's a recognition that legal changes are not going to free us entirely. They have failed. We can't trust the American judicial system or legal system to just fix things for us. We are awaiting the literal return of Christ, but that also motivates social action in the world. And so I just think it would be helpful for some people that you can have totally legitimate criticisms of a mostly white revival that doesn't cause changes in social action if you want to, but don't pin that on all revivalism. That's not historically been true. And it especially has not been true in more marginalized communities. And the real place for, I think, a lot of us who are watching from afar from Asbury to look is not just the history of white revivalism in America, but to think more broadly about that and say, not just as a means of judging Asbury to decide if it's legit or not, but as a means of seeking the real present work of the Spirit in our own communities, to not just look at the history of people that look like us, but to look at history more broadly.
Yeah. The Azusa Street Revival was led by William J. Seymour, an African-American preacher, which is why it was so interracial and so, groundbreaking at its time. The sad irony, of course, is that it then led to the founding of Pentecostalism in America and the first Pentecostal association, which did not allow African-American denominations to join. So his own the guy who started it couldn't bring his own group of churches into the movement he started because he was Black.
That raises a broader historical dynamic, which I'm not an expert in at all. Maybe Caitlin has more insights in this. But when you look at the history of revivalism in the United States, there's been small revivals all over the place for a long, long time, churches and other places. But the big kind of culturally shifting ones, like the First Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards, what's his name?
Whitfield. Edwards.
Whitfield. My gosh, yes. I wrote my senior thesis on him. And then the Second Great Awakening with Finney and Azusa Street and other things. Most of these were non-church centric revivals. They were parachurch. They were out in the open air preaching. They were, Azusa Street, right? It's not. So it's interesting to me that they're not primarily born out of existing denominations or institutions. And when they end up founding those institutions, coming out of these revivals, they end up carrying some of the cultural baggage and limitations that we're trying to kick against, as you mentioned, right, Phil, with Azusa. So it makes me wonder if I was talking to a friend recently who has access to some new data that I'm sure we'll report on in the months ahead that shows that the younger generation, young adults and teens today, are incredibly spiritually hungry, perhaps more than any recent generation that we've got data on. And yet they're also the generation that's the least likely to turn to an evangelical church to have that spiritual hunger addressed, because they have such negative connotations of churches in America right now for all the reasons we talk about all the time, which seems like an ideal recipe for revivalism, or at least awakening, right? But it's probably not going to happen in the institutional church. It's going to be outside of that in some parachurch or parallel thing.
Say you want a revival, Sky. I want to start a revival. Is that kind of like saying I want to make a video that's going to go viral? Is that kind of completely beyond your control?
I think the point should be what Caitlin said earlier. It should be, I have a deep hunger for God, and I want to draw closer into communion with him, and I want to gather with sisters and brothers who also have that hunger and want to draw closer to him. And the goal is to draw closer to God. The goal is not to spark a revival.
Yeah. One thing that was kind of interesting, and this sort of transitions into our next story, on the Barry Weiss podcast, they interviewed the pastor, I think was a faculty member, who actually gave the sermon that started the whole thing, who had just flown back into town from a trip and had no time to prepare. So he threw something together really fast that he thought was like, this is terrible. Even after he spoke, he told his wife, I think that was horrid. But what he focused on, the message that he focused on was love and the feeling of receiving real, genuine love from God, when so much of what we're getting in our culture and even from one another is false love, or love with an ulterior motive. And one of his calls in that message was, if you feel, so he's talking to a room full of Gen Z folks, says, if you don't feel like you've ever really been loved, would you just come forward? Truly experience love. And that's what started, 18 students came forward, and then most of the rest of them went back to class, but then the 18 students just kept going and kept singing, and then they interviewed a few other students who then their phones started lighting up. Said, come back here. This is really interesting what's happening. But so that it made me think, because the other story we wanted to talk about today was the new report from the CDC on mental health struggles, particularly among teenage girls. And they've just done a study that said nearly 1 in 3 high school girls said they have considered suicide, and a 60% rise in the past 10 years. Nearly 50% have been forced to have sex against their will. About 6 in 10 girls were so persistently sad or hopeless that they stopped regular activities. So, we want to talk about that, but I'm also realizing, well, this is the generation of kids that pastor said, are you struggling to be actually truly loved? And I think it's just fascinating that might have been, pulling the cork that let all this out, was not, come and confess your sins. Tell us how you've been bad. But bring your pain of wanting to be loved, but failing to be loved.
Well, and not to back up the conversation again, but even in those past awakenings or revivals, I think that was also the real issue. It may have been presented of come forward and confess your sins, but even people responding to that, it was because they felt like, I cannot be loved with these sins on me, and I need to unburden them and receive God's love. So it comes in different ways, but I think that is the core of any awakening or revival, is this deep longing we have, which can only be truly engaged through our Creator. And what is the barrier that's in the way of it? And sometimes it is my sin. Other times it's just the garbage of our society right now, which is what this study of these teen girls is revealing, and especially the social media component of it. It's debilitating and horrible.
Right. So we have two things here. We have a study from the CDC that's showing extreme issues of mental health, depression, suicidal ideation among teenage girls. And then we have a study by Jonathan Haidt, who we've talked about before. He's done a lot of really good work that's trying to clearly causally link what's happening with mental health with young kids, particularly women, girls, to social media. And the fact, that in the words of Bo Burnham, we've put the world in your hand. And the world doesn't love you very much, but that's with you all the time. So Haidt goes back and looks at, what happened in 2012. What happened in 2012 was the iPhone 4 came out. What was significant about the iPhone 4? It was the first smartphone with a front-facing camera. Now, you forget, that was 10 years ago. We've only had mass selfie culture for 10 years. How hard was it to take a selfie before we had a front-facing camera? Because you didn't know if you were in the shot. You're just pointing a camera at yourself with no ability to know no ability to know in real time what you look like. What do I look like right now?
Mm-hmm.
So he talks about, starting in 2012, you get the iPhone 4 with the front-facing camera, and you get the launch of Instagram. And by 2015, Instagram and selfie culture are dominating youth culture, especially among girls. And you start to see this precipitous decline in mental health and rise in anxiety and depression. And a lot of researchers have tried to say, well, no, it's not. Maybe it's not. Maybe that's just correlation, not causation. But Haidt and his research buddies are showing pretty convincingly, no, it's not correlation. It's causation.
Yeah. So I have three teenagers, 2 girls. They're all in this generation that have walked through this, and to varying degrees with them and their peers, I have seen this up close. And it feels a little bit to me like we are in an era similar to when there were early warning signs that tobacco caused serious health problems, but there was a concerted effort by the whole tobacco industry to downplay that or to poke holes in the research or, to whatever. And it took a generation before the government and others were like, no, tobacco causes emphysema and lung cancer and all these other terrible diseases, and we need to warn everyone about it. Even some of the articles I read about this CDC study, it felt to me like they were downplaying the social media component of all this, or making it just one of many factors, and who really knows what's the cause. And I don't know why they're doing that, but I wonder if a generation from now we're going to look back at this time and be like, oh my gosh, we sacrificed an entire generation of young people, and especially our daughters.
Yes.
Because we weren't willing to acknowledge what we all knew what was going on. And I mean, think about this. If there was a new additive in soda pop that was put in 2012, and suddenly you saw a 60% increase in some physical health disorder with young people drinking this stuff, would there be anyone saying, oh, no, let's not deal with this? There'd be outrage. But here
Coca-Cola would be saying that if they manufactured the
But
the item.
We see a 60% increase in suicide and suicide ideation and all these other depression, anxieties, and there aren't nationwide calls for greater regulation I could go on. I'll shut up. But
Here's what Jonathan Haidt says, because he puts a couple of things together. He says, in brief, it's the transition from a play-based childhood involving a lot of risky, unsupervised play, which is essential for overcoming fear and fragility, so a transition from that, a play-based childhood, to a phone-based childhood, which blocks normal human development by taking time away from sleep, play, and in-person socializing, as well as causing addiction and drowning kids in social comparisons they can't win. That's seems pretty clear.
Yeah. I got to tell you, Sky, I don't want to think that there's a single explanation for this, but it does seem so crystal clear to me that it's about money. Like everyone, almost everyone at this point who's involved in writing these articles, we have a vested interest in the internet being a place where people make lots of money. In some way, shape, or form, so many people involved in this, their careers are dependent on social media and the internet. And you hook kids in at a young age, and you can sell that. People make so much money off of the anxieties that are produced by social media, off of the addictions that people have to apps and games and social media platforms. And I keep coming back to this because I just think it's such a helpful comparison. But in Andy Crouch's book, The Life We're Looking For, I just think the connection between our technology-saturated world and the power of mammon in modern Western world is so tight. Like, there is a reason why it feels inexplicable why people would be so hesitant to make this claim, why people would, Haidt in that thing kind of goes through the people who have consistently not only just kind of equivocated or been unsure, but who have denied this, who have been critical of the claims that he's made. And to me, it just seems so obvious that these are not people who are necessarily evil or have evil intentions, but the structure of the world that we live in is shaped by our access to each other that makes so many people lots of money. And so the incentive to prevent people from seeing this link is huge.
Wait, say that again. The structure of our world, say that again.
I don't remember what I said.
Say that again. The structure of our world is created by access to each other for the purpose of money? Is
the
that
purpose
what
of
you
making
said?
money. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
The structure.
Caitlin.
But I think it's, I mean, I thought one of the most crucial parts, I forget which article you sent talked about this, but the idea that I think it was the Hype piece. He said, it's not just one person who is negatively affected by their access constantly through their smartphone to social media or other, access on the internet. It is the kind of culture that it creates, the social world that it creates. And a huge part of that social world is presenting yourself for the consumption of others. Mm-hmm. And people make so much money, not only off of your desire to present yourself, to pay money to Instagram, to boost your, visibility to people, but to buy products. I'm thinking especially again of girls, to buy products, to buy clothes, to buy access to people. I mean, it is all of their relationships. And I feel this even myself. I feel like I was old enough that I was in college by the time I got a smartphone. But even for my generation of folks, so much of our lives have been shaped by presenting ourselves well to other people. And our relationships are all mediated that way. And people make lots of money off of it. And when you think about just the sheer amount of money that is involved in this, then it is when it starts to feel like this is the whole system of the world that we're in, because it's so many of these industries that are involved in it. And I don't say that to be like creepy and conspiracy theory, like Phil made me sound for a minute there, but just like this is, I think,
that was profound. I wanted to hear it again.
I think it's a powers and principalities issue. Like this is not just about the world as we see it. This is about evil operating in these systemic ways, often motivated by money, in a way that doesn't just cause us to buy makeup or clothes or kind of the superficial explanations people will give of teenage girls. It is cancerous on our social relationships that are so deeply foundational to what it means to be human.
I 100% agree with you, Caitlin. And you've done a great job of articulating sort of the mammon side of this, the money side of it. Let me focus a little bit more on the system side of it, because one of the things that Jonathan Haidt brought out in his article is that we have a collective action problem. And so they show the data that the more hours a teenager spends on social media, the higher the rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, all this sort of stuff. So then the natural, obvious solution is, well, mom and dad, take your kid off of social media. The problem with that is they've shown that when you take them off of social media, it doesn't solve the problem, because their entire friend group, their entire network is this is how they communicate. Right. So by taking away the device, you've only now perhaps increased their social media.
So
their anxiety.
Here's how Haidt summarizes that. Haidt says that what we see in this case is that social media creates a cohort effect, something that happened to a whole cohort of young people, including those who don't use social media. It also creates a trap, a collective action problem for girls and for parents. Each girl might be worse off quitting Instagram, even though all girls would be better off if everyone quit. Right. So you can't just, it's like when every kid plays youth sports, you don't solve your loneliness by not playing youth sports. You have to kind of give in and go along with it, or, because you can't just start playing with everyone if one person refuses to go to youth sports because everyone else is there.
And this is the conversation I've had with my wife and basically every other parent I know of a teenager, where they all go, these devices and social media, we know it's not good for our kids, but we can't take it away entirely because it just makes it worse because everyone else is on it. That's the collective action problem. But here's the point, I think, where we're really in trouble, especially as Americans and our high individualism. We culturally lack the systemic thinking to deal with collective action problems. This is especially prevalent on the conservative end of the spectrum, where there's this whole movement now for the last number of years saying that racism is a non-systemic issue. It's just about individual hearts. And that permeates a lot of our thinking about every problem. It's not systemic. It's just individuals need to be reformed. Well, there's a lot of individual teenagers that have a lot of problem with anxiety and depression right now, fueled by social media. And there is no individualistic solution to that. It has to be collective action. There has to be a systemic approach to say, we need to create a system where teenagers en masse are not on social media for everyone's health. this is exactly what government is for. It's to take collective action. I mean, could you imagine if Canada invaded the United States with super pigs? Like, it would require collective action. That's what an army is. That's what a military is. It's collective action.
They aren't?
That's right. They could be. But like, we understand that. We understand it. Ukraine right now has a collective action against the invasion from Russia. It's not everyone just individually fight the Russians. It's we as Ukrainians with international help are going to fight the Russians.
But Sky, we can't trust the government. We can't trust the government because they're coastal elites and they hate me.
Well, fine. Trust your school board, your local school, whatever. We could make collective decisions as a community, as school. Yes, we can make these, or even private schools. They can make the decision to say, we're not going to allow social media as part of our kids' education, period, whatever. So it's not something that a single family or household or parent can solve. It takes a community to do this. And our kids are at stake, our teenagers are at stake, but we don't have the systemic imagination in so many of American households and communities to think this way because we deny it over and over. There's a whole political movement designed to deny this aspect of reality. And that's a huge problem to solve this issue with our teenagers.
Yeah, and there's one large study that's been quoted a lot that said there was a negligible impact of technology on mental health. But what they were studying was screen time, total screen time, which included watching TV, watching Netflix, watching anything. And for just screen time, it's not as detrimental. It doesn't drive you into depression, but then like social media does, And when you take away Netflix and take away all the other things, and say, what about kids that just are heavy on Facebook or heavy on Instagram, even if they never do any other screen time? They don't play,
there are no kids on Facebook. Phil.
I was just going to say, what are you talking about?
My kids were on Facebook.
Well,
actually, one of my kids was on MySpace.
Your kids are not kids anymore.
Yeah, I know. This is true. Anywho, what do we do about it? Does it do any good if you say, okay, this classroom at this school is going to have no phones? If every other classroom at a school, do you have to do it? What's like the smallest unit that could actually make a change that would have an impact? Caitlin?
Well, when I was reading these articles, I was really thinking about, a few weeks ago, I listened to First Person, the podcast that the New York Times does about people who are, they'll interview someone who wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times. And a recent one was this teenage girl, I think she's like 16, who a couple of years ago, I think towards the start of the pandemic, was really sick of social media. And so got rid of all her social media and then eventually they talk a lot about her flip phone, which I'm sure for some people doesn't sound so revolutionary, but for her, even I thinking about it was like, oh my gosh, if you only had a flip phone, like how would I navigate anywhere? But she was really committed, and she saw the way that being, especially at the start of the pandemic, being so absorbed in social media was harming her creativity and her sense of identity and self and her family. And so she got rid of all of it. And she started what she called a Luddite club at her school once they were back in person. And it's a really sweet interview. I'd recommend people listen to it. But it was helpful for me both to realize there are smaller units, as you've said, Phil, in terms of community, where she found a group of teenagers that were just like, she lives in New York City, so they meet once a week and they like go see a play or they go to a park and just like the sheer fact that they live their social lives outside of the main form that their peers are existing in has put them into a really tight community that the whole time, she's talking about this, like it's this revolutionary thing. You're thinking like, yeah, this is how humans were meant to live together. But I think the other part of it that's really striking and actually gave me a lot of hope was I do think it isn't just inevitable that we will continue down this path. I think the forces for it are very strong. Like I said, I really think there's a spiritual power going on here, and I really think the financial interest, which is also a spiritual power in my mind, is really strong. But I do think a lot of young people will surprise us with their complete distaste for social media and the way that it forms them. And I think instead of focusing, I think a lot of this stuff ends up being telling parents, take your kids' phones away, or telling teachers, have rules about phones. I really think a better strategy, because I think a lot of the kind of top-down ones will be really hard to implement and will probably just cause more relational frustration than anything else. I'm not opposed to that. I think some of them could be good, but I think they'll be really hard to be effective. I think working within families, within churches, especially within schools and other smaller communities to have conversations with kids about what do you really want out of life? Like, what is good and what makes you happy and what doesn't? Because I think sometimes Christians in particular, we evangelicals especially, we're really into just like, let's figure out the rules. And we forget that, especially in the Bible, the rules are given to us because God knows how we best flourish. And a more productive way, I think, a huge portion of these articles, especially about teen girls, are also about sex and sexual ethics. Similarly, in both these conversations about technology and about sex and about community, I think it would be really good to have more of an approach with young people of, talk me through, like, what's enjoyable in your life and what's not. Was this kind of like sex positive encounter really great? Or how did it make you actually feel? Not, here are the rules and follow them. There's a place for that and a time for that. But really saying, like, how do you feel after you've been on Instagram for a couple of hours? What moments in your life feel the most exciting and good to you? And having those kinds of conversations, because I think more of this can happen organically. It's hard. I don't want to at all downplay the great systemic power at work here. But I also think sometimes we forget that this is really a better life to not be so sucked in, and people can get there, I think, if we really work on discipleship in those ways.
I love that idea. I'm just wondering how many of us are like that 16-year-old girl or like Greta Thunberg that don't mind standing up against the mob.
No,
saying,
totally.
I don't care if you think I'm weird. I cared so much if people thought I was weird in middle school.
And most parents, for good reasons, want their kids to acclimate and be accepted and be normal. And it's very hard to go against the current. I appreciate, Caitlin, your hope that there will be pockets of resistance or, alternative ways of, and that's no doubt going to happen. So now it's my turn to take the pessimistic view.
Never do that.
I know I never do that.
What's happening?
I think this is probably going to play out very similar to the way gun culture has played out in America. And here's why.
Not well.
No, well, partly because we have an utterly dysfunctional federal government that is incapable of, on multiple fronts, it's just not able to move the needle on any of our major problems in this country. But I think what's going to end up happening is the rest of the world, at least Europe, the EU, China, other parts of the world that recognize this similar problem and have functional governments, even though some of them might be more oppressive than others, they are probably going to pass legislation and institute significant restrictions on young people's access to these platforms. Similar to the way we don't allow kids to drive, we don't allow them to drink, we don't allow them to have tobacco products because we recognize the health concerns. The mental health concerns are going to become so clear that these other cultures and countries are going to create bans on them. The United States, my hunch is, won't be able to do it. And we will see the proliferation of this the way we have guns. And it's very similar. Like, people feel like I need to own a gun because everyone else owns a gun and I don't want to be outgunned by the person who comes after. I have to be on social media because everyone else is on social media and I don't want to be left out and everything. And then when someone
social media.
Right. And when someone at a school board meeting or whatever says, hey, I think we need to ban this for our students, parents are going to flip out and go, not my kids, because my kids are friends with kids at that school and they have it. My kid's not going to have. And it's going to create this arms race on social media. And we're going to continue to see the destruction of young people and the mental health outcomes. And it might take a generation or two before it's so bad. And America is losing so much ground to China and the EU and these other more stable cultures that aren't destroying their young people with this stuff, that maybe then we will get to the place of this is madness. We have to do something about it. But
Sky,
I don't have confidence that my government will take a proactive stance on saving young people's lives. I just don't.
The only way to stop a bad guy with Instagram is a good guy with Instagram.
But
the Chinese.
Phil, wait, that's so important.
Caitlin?
Like, the description that you just gave is the uncritical Christian approach in so many youth groups that I've heard. Is like, be a good Christian on Instagram, not a bad person. Not, is there a distinctly Christian view of human beings and how we best flourish that should inform what we're doing with social media?
Isn't that a little bit like saying bring a tract to your casual sex hookups?
I've never heard that one.
No, instead of backing up and saying, wait a minute, I question the whole system. I question the premise. See, China has an advantage because they're a top-down authoritarian regime. They have rules on their video games that are system-wide. Like, they have video games that kids can't play for more than 2 hours a day, and it's enforced by the video game company. If you want this video game to be offered online in China, you have to make it only playable 2 hours a day. And now they've upped some of those requirements to this can only be playable on weekends. Your online video game cannot be accessed by any Chinese children on Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday because they need to do their schoolwork. And then, of course, some of those games are from China. They're offering the same thing in the U.S. without any of those restrictions on it because they look at us and they laugh. Ha, 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 ha. Look, they're amusing themselves to death. So we can't do that, though, because we're a bottom-up society, not a top-down society, and we resent all of that.
There's some truth to that, but throughout the history of this country, we have regulated dangerous things all the time.
Yeah.
And we have collectively in a democratic system decided that we believe, for example, in most places, young people should not have access to alcohol before 21. Of course, they get it, but it's not encouraged. And so we have a system for doing this. The problem is our system is broken because of stuff we've talked about before. Polarization in our politics, bad media ethics, gerrymandered districts, and especially our primary system, which rewards nuttiness on both extremes. And the majority of Americans who want things like common sense gun control laws or common sense views on abortion, things like that. None of that gets through, even though it's what most Americans think, because the extremes won't allow it. And I think this is going to be another case where most Americans are going to go, yes, we think there needs to be some larger regulation of these platforms for our kids, and the government's going to be incapable of doing it because the crazies on both extremes aren't going to allow it to happen. And that's what's destroying us. And until we fix that political broken system, we're not going to be able to solve this or any of our other significant societal problems.
It does seem though like this might be one of those issues that becomes a horseshoe, and the ends kind of bend around to meet, because if you're liberal, you can look at this and this is causing huge mental health issues and huge mental health expenses. And if you're conservative, you say, and it's exposing our kids to terrible things. Can't we agree that this is could we put drag shows on Instagram so that conservatives would actually want to ban it?
But you're seeing the opposite right now. And David French and I have talked about this, especially in Texas and Florida right now. There are movements to deregulate social media from conservatives because they feel like these social media platforms are biased towards liberals. So they're trying to deregulate them and make them less policed and the content freer. So there isn't any consensus on this at all.
Oh, man. Caitlin, what do we do? Because we have to wrap up. So you need to tell us what we need to do.
I will say, I share a lot of Sky's pessimism, but I also
you
one of the things.
her.
No. Listen, one of the things that I really did learn listening to this interview with this really, again, remarkable 16-year-old girl. She is not representative of all the 16-year-olds that are just getting flip phones. But what I did think was so interesting about it was that ultimately her hunger, as you talked about in the beginning, Phil, was to have relationships, to be loved well. And the church has an incredible opportunity here to both say that true thing to young people. Again, these articles were not just about social media and phone use. They were about the really deep emotional issues that especially teenage girls are dealing with when it comes to sexual harassment, when it comes to larger political issues. We have access via social media, not just to comparison and beauty standards, but to every horrible thing that happens all the time. The church has an incredible opportunity to say to young people, you are deeply loved by the creator of the universe, and his deep love for you and for me is motivating me to take care of you in tangible ways, to be the hands and feet of Christ in your life. And that's an opportunity that I fear we will miss if we're too focused on some of the big culture war things that tend to divide our churches and some of the kind of all of the dynamics that Sky was just describing. But I do think instead of just focusing on the phones, which are a really crucial and important part of this, I do think the gift the church has is to just say, we look deeper than that. We look into the real needs of human hearts, the real brokenness inside of us, and we meet that both with the truth of the gospel and the God who loves you, and also with the tangible representation of that love through the people of God in a local church.
That's good. So maybe we could just say, okay, we're going to do an experiment for 4 months. Social media is completely unrestricted. So now you get Alex Jones conspiracy theories to your kids, and you get Drag Queen Story Hour to your kids. Okay, does anyone think this is a good idea? Anyone, anywhere. And then you can do something. That's pretty good.
I think we should put you in charge, Phil.
Put me in charge. I'll do it. I'll be the guy. Oh boy, I have enough people mad at me already. Okay, thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Sky. Thank you, everybody. Patreon subscribers who support us, we really appreciate it. We have a good interview. I don't remember what it is, but it's super great. So hang around and you're going to enjoy it. And we'll see you all next week. Bye. This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Miracle Made. Hey, we have a new sponsor here on The Holy Post. Did you know that your temperature at night can have one of the greatest impacts on your sleep quality? If you wake up too hot or too cold, you need to check out Miracle Made's bed sheets, inspired by silver-infused fabrics made by NASA. That's right, it's rocket science. Miracle Made makes temperature-regulating bedding so you can sleep at the perfect temperature all night long. Go to trymiracle.com/holypost to try it today. And we have a special deal for our listeners. Save over 40%, plus use our promo code HOLYPOST at checkout to save even more and get 3 free towels. Free towels! That's pretty great! Miracle Made sheets come with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/holypost and use the code HOLYPOST to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off. Again, that's trymiracle.com/holypost to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this episode. Today's episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Magic Spoon. What's that? Let me explain. I got a box in the mail from a new company that wanted to sponsor the podcast. I opened it up and it was full of breakfast cereal. I like breakfast cereal, but the box said this cereal had 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and 4 to 5 net grams of carbs. It's high protein, no sugar, keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, and soy-free. And I thought, oh no, this is going to taste like packing peanuts. So I poured myself a small bowl of the peanut butter flavor and gave it a try. And the next thing I said was, Lisa, you got to come try this. And she said, wow, that's really good. But then our 6-year-old granddaughter, Marley, came over, so we had her test it. She tried all 4 flavors that come in the variety pack: cocoa, fruity, frosted, and peanut butter. And then she wanted to eat more. She liked them so much, she asked if she could take the whole box back to her house. Seriously, Magic Spoon cereal, only 140 calories a serving, and it tastes really good. You got to check this out. So go to magicspoon.com/holypost to grab a variety pack and try it today. And be sure to use our promo code HOLYPOST at checkout to save $5 off your order. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember, get your next delicious bowl of high-protein cereal at magicspoon.com/holypost and use the code HOLYPOST to save $5 off. And thank you to Magic Spoon for surprising me and for sponsoring this episode.
There is no doubt that Revelation is one of the most misunderstood and least taught parts of the Bible. For many of us, it's been shaped primarily in our imaginations by Christian media, meaning radio and television and books, and a lot of them have given us a very modern but false understanding of what this book was intended to be. Scot McKnight is trying to correct that with his latest book called Revelation for the Rest of Us, a prophetic call to follow Jesus as a dissident disciple. In one way, he's taken us back to the first century to help us understand what the author of Revelation intended for his original audience to get from this book. But then McKnight allows us to understand how this book is perpetually relevant for Christians in every age, because we are all living in Babylon and we are all called to be faithful witnesses of Jesus in this very antagonistic environment. His take on it is refreshing, it's helpful, it's approachable, and I think you're going to resonate with our conversation where he talks about the false ways he was taught about Revelation as a young person and why we don't hear more about Revelation in our churches today. I think his response to that one will be surprising. If you are a supporter of the Holy Post, there's also a bonus interview I've done with Scot McKnight, specifically around Revelation 20 and a few verses there about the millennium. Why have we allowed 3 verses in the book to define our entire interpretation of it, and for some Christians, their entire view of their faith? McKnight has some really helpful details about the millennium that we often overlook, and I promise you that bonus interview is fantastic and you won't be disappointed. If you're not yet a Holy Post supporter, go to holypost.com, click support us, you'll get access to that interview, past bonus interviews with our guests, special shows like Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess, our book club, special merchandise, the live stream, all kinds of other stuff. You'll be like in the center of the whole Holy Post community. So definitely go do that. We'd love for you to join us. Here is my conversation with Scot McKnight about Revelation. Scot McKnight, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Sky, good to be with you. I've been talking to you for years.
I know. We go way back. I don't think we've ever had a conversation about Revelation, though.
Oh, that's probably right. I kept all this stuff under wraps, man. I don't want to get myself in trouble.
Well, now, why now? Why are you willing to put your neck on the line with this one?
Well, I was ready to go to this because I taught a class at Northern Seminary on it. And I worked out my ideas, and I thought, okay, I'm ready to write this up now. So that's why it's been percolating for 25 years.
Well, that's clear, especially at the beginning of the book where you talk about your own upbringing in the church and the approach to Revelation that I think a lot of people listening to this will resonate with. You call it the speculation approach. Define what you mean by that. What was the general attitude about Revelation when you were a young person in the church?
Well, Christopher Rowland says it right. He's a great scholar on apocalyptic literature, the Jewish literature that is connected to the book of Revelation, when he calls it a repository of biblical prophecies. And I grew up with this, is that the book of Revelation is a series of images that if you read carefully along with your newspaper and understand America's history and its relationship to Israel and to Europe and to Russia, those are the only countries that seem to matter.
Right.
You will understand what this book is all about. And time after time, I heard, now my senior pastor, when I guess we didn't call him that, my pastor, when I was in junior high and high school, was really not into the book of Revelation. But in high school, I had a youth pastor who was, and it was the early 70s, and Hal Lindsey and Salem Kurban. Most people don't know who Salem Kurban is, but Salem Kurban was Hal Lindsey before Hal Lindsey became Hal Lindsey. He was writing the same things. And I remember in college someone saying, well, Hal Lindsey just plagiarized his ideas from Salem Kurban. And I read a book of Salem Kurban's, but it was the speculation approach basically is this, that the book of Revelation is predicting very specific events in the end time. And if you read the book carefully and identify the right people and the right movements and the right nations, you will understand what this book is all about. So it becomes a game, and I don't mean that in a terribly negative way, but it sort of becomes a game of who did what or who is doing what. And when I was in college, people like Kissinger and Gorbachev with his birthmark became sort of, they were actually, I heard people say Gorbachev is the Antichrist. You can tell by that birthmark.
I have this vivid memory. I have this vivid memory of going to a Christian bookstore as a boy with my mom and seeing a book on the shelf that had a picture of Gorbachev with his birthmark on his head clearly showing, and something about the Antichrist. Yeah. And then going back some years later when I was a high school student to this same Christian bookstore and seeing almost the exact same book, but now it was Saddam Hussein who was on the cover. And, he was... This is the early 90s, so now he's the Antichrist. And maybe there's a newer version.
You were in high school. Yeah.
I graduated high school in 94. So, but it's always, you're just taking the same imagery from Revelation and using it as a lens upon whatever the newspaper is saying today. So who fits these different categories?
Yeah. So Putin today, could be this person. And
or Anthony Fauci.
Is it was so, that's a good one. They were so skilled and convinced of it that it was, as a high school kid, I was scared. I mean, it really was frightening to think we're at the end of history. I remember in the youth group, a Sunday evening youth group, one of my friends in the youth group said, I hope Jesus doesn't return this year. I want to get married and have sex at least once. So
I think that conversation has happened in every youth group since at least the 1950s, right?
Yeah. So, but I grew up in the 70s, and I call it speculation. It's always speculating who is doing what in our world according to the book of Revelation. And then it's like everything falls into place, and now we know what's going to happen. That's the speculative approach.
Early in the book, you say this: I changed my mind not only because every one of the certain predictions I heard from preachers and youth pastors and read in books were wrong, and not just slightly off, but totally wrong. You go on to say, I came to see that this approach as dangerous for the church. I can understand why a lot of us would go back and look at the Gorbachev book or the Saddam Hussein book and go, okay, they're wrong. They were off track here. But you're arguing it's not merely its error that is the problem, that this approach to Revelation is flat out dangerous. What's dangerous about it, apart from just being an error?
Yeah, I think I really do think it is wrong. It has been, I tell my students, every one of these people have been wrong. At some point we say, okay, let's do something different, because we're going to be wrong if we start doing the same thing of speculating. The biggest thing to me is the book of Revelation for these people becomes sort of like a jigsaw puzzle or some kind of game that you play. If you play right, you'll figure out what's going on in the world. And it all becomes about identification. And the book of Revelation then becomes nothing other than speculative prophecy or prophecy about something. And they miss the discipleship theological message of the book as, in a sense, telling people how to live when Babylon is the dominant mode of empire or government. Instead of producing disciples who are theologically astute about politics in our world and alert and discerning of what's going on politically, they become people who are worried about the future and guessing about who will do what on some kind of speculative program, some timeline, some chart of chronology. And they become people who live, in a sense, for guessing what will happen in the future rather than discerning what's going on now.
So you make the case in the book that, there's a number of reasons why that speculative approach became so popular. But two of them, which you outline in the book, is one, it sells. It's really spectacular for marketing purposes and captures people's imaginations and makes them afraid, and it's a great way to move merchandise. But the other reason is it's deeply rooted in a dispensational theology and approach to the entire Bible. And you reference Gorski, who outlines a number of problems with the dispensational approach to reading Revelation. And I'm sure you don't have this right in front of you, but I'd be happy to quote you back to yourself. He has 4 ideas that are dangerous about this dispensational reading of Revelation. One is hubris, that the idea that we know what's going to happen, that arrogance. Second one is demonization, that we have a clear understanding of who our enemies are, and they're the bad guys. Fatalism, this is happening, there's nothing we can do about it, the future is set. And the fourth one, which is the reason I bring this up, is violence. That the solution, the ultimate way of vindicating God's people is through the violent overthrow of our enemies. That kind of rhetoric is very prevalent right now in sort of the Christian nationalist movement. So how do you see the dispensational approach to Revelation fueling some of the current dynamics we're seeing in especially white evangelicalism around Christian nationalism?
Well, Sky, this is a good question. And Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead, along with now Gorski, who's kind of joined them as a team, are writing very eloquently and intelligently about Christian nationalism. But dispensationalism, at its root, calls itself a literal method. They read the book of Revelation literally. They read prophecy literally. I learned this in college, that the amillennialists down the street at Calvin Seminary and Calvin College read prophecy spiritually, but we read it literally. And by that they mean these actual events in the book of Revelation are going to happen on the plane of history, just as they are described. So there's going to be this battle. I can remember being just absolutely mesmerized by the sense of a valley filled with blood so high that it's up to the horses' bridles. And Sky, I've been in that valley. There is no way any blood can go that high because there's too many valleys out of it that would. So, but they see these things literally. And that literal method leads to this conviction that there is going to be a battle. God's people are going to win. And they are God's people. And before long, that becomes America, who is aligned with Israel. Now, look, Paul Boyer wrote this book, When Time Shall Be No More. Ronald Reagan was totally convinced of these sorts of interpretations, and he admitted at times that he even says, we quote him in the book. He even says, that this could be Armageddon or this could be the end time. And they see this connected to America. They have sketched these 10 tribes or these 10 heads and nations connected to Rome, Babylon, and they are the European nation, and they were counting these nations. So all these nations piled up on top of one another create this literal sense, and then the battle becomes a literal battle. It's bloody, it's gory, it's hyper-violent, and they think that this is exactly what's going to happen, and it sort of justifies violence. And I'm one who gets really nervous about that kind of literal reading, in part because it leads to this kind of violence. But, it takes imagination to read this book. It takes a sensibility and a sensitivity to how images work. And we say this quite often in the book, Cody Matchett and I, who's the co-author. We say quite often that this book is more like Where the Wild Things Are, Lord of the Rings, Christian fiction, fantasy type stuff, than it is about predictive prophecy. And when you start seeing it this way, you and I don't read the battles of Lord of the Rings, which, by the way, I've never totally finished, but I keep trying. Or in the Chronicles of Narnia. We don't say, well, this is what we should be doing, because we know that this is about sort of a cosmic vision of good versus evil, and that good is eventually going to win. That's the way I read the violence, but it's apocalyptic literature in the Jewish world was very violent.
But before we get into some of the interpretive framework that you use, which I'm convinced by as well, you talk about how the speculative approach that you grew up in and that a lot of us have been shaped by, a lot of us have realized, okay, this is kind of ridiculous and it doesn't work, or it leads to really bad interpretive things, like you're saying, taking these battles literally. But the pendulum has sort of swung too far in the opposite direction, where we're no longer Hal Lindsey and late Great Planet Earth and every pastor's up there, with a newspaper and trying to predict what's going on. But now we've shifted all the way over to silence, where in an awful lot, I was reading your book, I'm thinking to myself, I'm 47 years old. I'm not sure I've ever heard Revelation preached, ever, in a church, even my own church. And I've heard, Bible studies on it or maybe classes, but I don't think I've ever heard a sermon series on Revelation in my entire life. So we've swung all the way over to this silence on this book. What's wrong with that, apart from the obvious that we're ignoring part of Scripture? What worries you about that way of reacting?
Guy, this is a really good question because it's complex. When I was in seminary, this is before you were in high school, maybe before you were born. When I was in seminary, it was sort of from 76 to 80, it was sort of the end of the Hal Lindsey era.
Mm-hmm.
But almost all the students were premillennialists in the sense that they believed in a millennium. Christ would come before the millennium, and they were pre-trib. And I was sort of teaching post-trib, and a couple other professors at Trinity were teaching post-trib once I became a professor. But the students realized they could not, when they got into churches, teach anything but pre-trib. All right, now, so this is a context in which what happened is that so many students and so many evangelical teachers, preachers, became convinced of an alternative interpretation that was not going to be heard on WMBI, and therefore was dangerous for them to talk about in their churches. So they went silent. They went on mute. But they were still kind of post-trib premillennialists. And they weren't teaching the book of Revelation. And I think that silence has damaged the church's witness and capacity to speak prophetically and speak intelligently into our churches, into our cultural context, so that we as evangelical Christians, because we have silenced and put the book of Revelation on mute, have not been discipled into the kind of discernment of Babylon in government powers, so that we no longer speak. We've gone silent on our ability to have a theopolitical imagination, if I can use that language.
It's fascinating you say that, because this is an issue that's come up frequently on the Holy Post, not in regards to eschatology or revelation, but just social discipleship or the social dimensions of the gospel. It feels like so many, I talk to pastors regularly, I did more often when I was at CT, who would give me really thoughtful, biblically saturated, theologically rich views of what was happening in society or in government or in, their community. And I would ask them, is that what you're teaching to your people? Oh, no. I can't talk about this because they're having their view shaped by conservative talk radio or by Moody radio or by what they're watching on Christian television. And so they remain silent on those things and essentially surrender that territory to the formative voices that people are hearing in the media. And a lot of Christian media is still shaped by the dispensational, speculative. I mean, John Hagee just opened up the rally for Nikki Haley at her announcement of running for president. And he's
I didn't know this.
Yeah, and he's kind of one of the leading voices on that speculative reading of Revelation. Yeah. So if our church leaders hold a different view but never share it because they're worried about the blowback, it makes sense why we're not hearing much about Revelation. We'd rather just be quiet about it.
When I was teaching, when I first started teaching at Trinity, my first 12 years, I was a professor at Trinity. And I would lecture on the book of Revelation. Once I got to teach that, it was called New Testament 6:12. And I would talk about this, and sometimes I talked about it in the Gospels class, that I presented a post-trib view. And I found that students were persuaded. Mm-hmm. But over time, I would ask students, what are you teaching about this? Oh, I can't teach that in the church. I would lose my job. So that right there is that is the biggest reason why we wrote this book, is because we want to provide something that is accessible and readable, that has an alternative imagination based on the book of Revelation that we think is more historically accurate and more in tune with what John was writing. And I mean, if I write, Richard Bauckham can write a 600-page book called The Climax of Prophecy, and it's full of intelligence, but the average person cannot comprehend the first 4 pages. So we want to make it comprehensible for ordinary people, so that we can try to help reconstruct the Christian imagination so that they will be discerning, dissident disciples of Babylon, something like that.
And you succeeded. It's a perfectly titled book for that reason, Revelation for the Rest of Us. Let's talk about your approach then to Revelation, how it differs from the speculation approach. You take a more idealist approach, arguing that what John depicts, especially in the latter portions of the book, are archetypes almost of a battle between good and evil, between the forces aligned with Jesus and the forces aligned with the empires of the world, Babylon, and that those images had direct first century application for the churches that John was writing to, but they continue to have direct application for the church in every era, because there are always new Babylons and there are always new generations aligned with Christ instead. Expand a little bit about how that fits in the structure of the book. I mean, you talk about the 3 sevens and all the different plagues and judgments. If you were, give us sort of the elevator pitch for your approach to Revelation. What is the right model by which to the broad high altitude model to interpret this book through?
Yeah, I've reacted sort of. That's not what we're doing. When people use terms like, "Are you a preterist? Are you an idealist?"
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of those terms get connected to how you understand the future. You know, it's all framed by this time thing, and that's not quite what we're doing. But here's the elevator pitch. There are 7 churches in Western Asia Minor who are struggling with how to live as faithful followers of Jesus in the Roman Empire when they seem to be powerless. And they seem to be capitulating and compromising with that culture in idolatry and sinfulness. Sexual sinfulness, particularly, is the imagery that John uses. And so, what we did, and this is I started doing this a long time ago, is I believed that you need to read the book of Revelation backwards. Now, I did a book on Romans like this, but this is a little different kind of backwards. In other words, I think we have to begin in Revelation 17 and 18 and understand Babylon. Babylon is Rome, but Babylon is timeless. There are always Babylons. Babylon was a very popular term in Jewish apocalyptic literature for describing empires and tyrants and dictators and oppressive governments. And there was a lot going on in the middle to the late of the first century in Jewish apocalyptic writings too. So we know that John's talking everybody's language. And once you understand Babylon, then you begin to understand what this book is actually trying to do. It's trying to tell the churches of Western Asia Minor, 7 of them, that Babylon is trying to weasel its way into our churches, trying to call us to live in the way of Rome, and John just crashes it, the way of Rome, with the way of the Lamb. And that the proper Christian response is obedience in the way of the Lamb and to worship the Lamb in such a way that over time it can become LOL in worship services, in the sense that we know that the Lamb's way is eternal and the way of justice, the way of peace, is not the way of Rome, but we may suffer if we walk in the way of the Lamb in this world. Now, that's dense. I've not ever given a elevator speech on our approach to the book of Revelation.
Well, I'm glad to give you the chance to practice with the Holy Post audience. That idea that there's always a new Babylon, there's always an oppressive regime that is opposed to the way of God's kingdom, injustice, dehumanizing, all that. That means that in any generation, we Christians who are reading this book of Revelation need to be asking ourselves, who's the Babylon now? And in what ways are we compromising our fidelity to Christ in order to win acceptance in that Babylon? If you go back to the speculative approach, it says, well, Babylon must be the Soviet Union, or Babylon must be Iraq, or Babylon must be, and that means America is not Babylon, and therefore we don't have to worry about it. But if you take it through the lens you're prescribing, it means that maybe we need to slow down and ask, well, in what ways might America be emulating the values of Babylon rather than that of the Lamb? And do we need to be careful that we're not getting too cozy with American empire as the church? I don't know too many people or churches that want to have that conversation. Could you imagine a pastor getting up in their pulpit and saying, hey, we're going to look at Revelation and how America looks a lot like Babylon? I mean, there would be shouts and outcry in that church, most likely.
Well, I think that's exactly what the book calls us to do. Instead of, this is what I call the speculative approach, is saying, I think it's Russia, but maybe it's Iraq, maybe it's Iran. And then saying, okay, then we're the people of God because we're Americans and we're aligned with Israel, and therefore we're on God's side. And all the nations that align with Israel are on God's side, and those who are against Israel are obviously on the Antichrist side. Instead of doing that, we recognize the major themes of Babylon, I think we could develop these in different ways, and we could probably add to it. And then begin to ask the question, where do we see this sort of violence, this sort of murderous, this sort of arrogance, this sort of opulence that we see in Babylon? I mean, that sketch of the whore, or whatever you want to translate the word, of Revelation 17 and 18 is just an amazing sketch of an empire ruled in ways that are themes that we have found throughout American history. There's
and world
all kinds
history.
of yeah. I mean, when we are dropping nuclear warheads on people, when we are spending billions of dollars every year, I don't know the budget items, on military, we're walking in the way of Rome. And when Christians align with that, they're saying the way to protect ourselves in this world is violent. It's with military. And you say that's what John was worried about in the first century. That's what he was against.
So let's dig into that. Let's dig into that a little bit more, because I've heard the argument from some believers that, of course, in this age, we are called to love our enemies, and we're called to non-retaliation and those other wonderful things that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, or Paul talks about in Romans 12. But the day is coming, they'll say, when you read Revelation, where Jesus is coming with a sword and he's coming on the white horse, and there's going to be this epic battle, and the believers are going to fight this, you mentioned Armageddon and the blood up to the bridles of the horses and all that. And so there's this very militant imagery in Revelation that some Christians look at and go, all right, we need to not be violent now, but man, the day's coming when we're really going to stick it to everybody who's been against us. You do something different with that violent imagery in Revelation and argue that it's always associated with Babylon. It's not associated with the way of the Lamb. So then explain, what do you do with the sword coming out of Jesus' mouth and that imagery of the rider on the white horse who slays his enemies? How are we misunderstanding?
With the word of God. The sword as the word of God. I mean, this has been a standard interpretation for centuries, is that they've recognized that the imagery of a sword in the book of Revelation out of the Lamb's mouth on the white horse is the language of the Word of God, being the most powerful instrument the church has to conquer its enemies. So, but look, the language there's language that looks violent. There are birds pecking on corpses. And it's gruesome, and it's barbaric, and it's very first century, and it's very apocalyptic, and it can breed people's sensibilities that violence is the way of God. But I think when you see that the Lamb conquers by his testimony, by the cross, and that the witnesses to the Lamb conquer by the same kind of testimony and their life as a witness and their word as a witness, then that violence is flipped. The script is flipped so that we begin to think of violence in a different way, even if it's using violent images, that we begin to think of it as an alternative form of victory.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that, because you draw it out so beautifully in the book where the sword coming out of Jesus' mouth, which I think is twice we see that in the beginning of the book when John first sees Jesus, and then again on the white horse. It's a sword in his mouth, not in his fist. So it's a sword, as you say, of the word rather than of literal violent action. And then the other thing that I've never noticed before, but it's right there, even though it says that the rider on the white horse slays his enemies with the sword from his mouth, no one aligned with Jesus, none of his followers or witnesses are ever seen in the book of Revelation fighting. They have victory through their testimony, not through actual physical violence. So to wrap it up, you say this: militarism is not the way of the Lamb. Instead, the Lamb wins by losing, and his losing liberates others. The Lamb liberates by giving his life, and the Lord wins the battle with the word, the Logos. So those who take Revelation as one day we will get to fight in a physical battle against the bad guys are fundamentally misinterpreting what the book is saying.
Totally. And that's why this is revelation for the rest of us, is that this interpretation, I think you would call it a theopolitical reading. And I'm a fan of Michael Gorman. I was thrilled to see that Miroslav Volf endorsed it. The fundamental word for a Christian, I think, in the book of Revelation is that a Christian is a witness. And the Greek word, is a martos, and this becomes the word for martyr. But fundamentally, a witness is someone who sees something, who witnesses and verbally tells someone about it, and then lives in light of that witness, even to the point of death, if that's what's necessary. And over, John emphasizes this idea of witness. And I think that people are called to be witnesses to the Lamb and to live in the way of the Lamb and to tell the story about Jesus and that Jesus is the world's true king, etc. And when they do that, they are waging the war of the Lamb in this world where they may be met by those who will wage in the way of Babylon and the way of Rome. And our weapons are, let's say, spiritual, and social, in a way unlike the way of Rome. And one of the complaints that John has is that the churches are acting. There's too much Rome in the churches of Western Asia Minor, and there needs to be a whole lot more of the Lamb.
Amen. And Scott, we've just scratched the surface of what's in this book, but gosh, this is a book for our moment, because the same thing you just said, John was arguing to the churches in Western Asia, is exactly what we're facing today. It seems like there's an awful lot of Babylon in the American church and not enough Lamb, which is why we need your book to see more clearly what it is John was trying to say to all of us. We have not touched on a number of things I really want to get to. Like, I love the fact that you have this section again that was new to me of seeing the judgments, the three sets of 7 judgments of God are not just judgments, but discipline of the world, and that they're actually used to bring the nations into loyalty to Jesus, which is amazing. The conversion of the imagery of the kings and their ships bringing all their goods into Babylon to the end where the kings are bringing the glory of the nations into New Jerusalem. Yeah. That's amazing. But you're going to stick around for a few minutes because we're going to talk exclusively for Holy Post supporters about the millennium from Revelation 20 and just why we've got that all screwed up in our thinking. So if you're a Holy Post supporter, number one, thank you for making these conversations with people like Scot McKnight possible, but then you can get that bonus interview. And if you're not yet a Holy Post supporter, go to holypost.com and click support us. Definitely pick up Scott's new book, Revelation for the Rest of Us. It will be revolutionary. It will be revealing. It will be an apocalypse in that regard and in showing you what the book was really meant to be. Scott, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you again, Sky.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.